Hi guys, Loz here with another Shadowverse video. In this video I wanted to go over one of the strongest decks in the current meta, which is a Tempo Forestcraft deck. This deck is basically built around creating fairies and then using them to combo with other very strong mid-range cards like Crystala Tia to kind of control the board right from the beginning of the game and then never let go. Kind of build a tempo advantage all the way throughout the game until eventually you just overwhelm your opponent. So let's have a look at the deck. Now, unlike all of my other videos so far, this deck is actually quite expensive to craft. It's around 30,000 vials. I only crafted it recently, sometime last week. So I mean, I've been playing this deck pretty much constantly at the A rank to kind of get a feel for how the deck works before I completed this video. So yeah, this deck is quite an advanced deck. It's quite expensive to make. It's actually quite difficult to play, especially if you're new to card games. You really need to understand the difference between tempo and value and building up tempo. If we're talking about Hearthstone, this deck, in my opinion, kind of plays similar to the old mid-range Druid. You kind of start the game chipping away at the health, building up the board, and then you have a very explosive finish with a combo finisher, as we'll see. So let's have a look at some of the cards of this deck. So we've got Water Fairy, so a 1/1 follower. Its last words are put a fairy in your hand. I mean, this is a pretty basic card. It's in pretty much all Forestcraft decks. The minion's not that strong, but you get a fairy that you can combo with your other cards, so it's worthwhile playing in your deck. I mean, it's not particularly strong, but you need to play this pretty much in all Forestcraft decks. Elf Child May, extremely strong combo card. I mean, it's only 1 mana, and I know it's only a 1/1, but deal 1 damage to a random enemy follower is a very strong ability. And there's also quite a few cards in this deck that bounce things back into your hand, so you'll find yourself playing this, bouncing it back, playing it again, and just really being able to take over the board. Nature's Guidance, return an allied follower or amulet to your hand and draw a card. So this is one of the cards I was talking about. This allows you to bounce cards like this back into your hand and replay their very strong battle cry effects, fanfare effects, and really gain a massive tempo advantage on the board. So I mean, this has lots of other uses. There's plenty of other strong cards in this deck that you can bounce back, but it also can just be used to draw a card if you need to cycle it. So you can play a fairy, play this, bounce it back. For 2 mana, you can draw a card, which is not great, but maybe it will save you. Fairy Circle, very standard card. Put 2 fairies in your hand. Again, the fairies generally you want to use to combo with your other cards, but I mean, in this deck, you can just play them naked on the board to build up like a tempo advantage in the game. Fairy Whisperer, another strong card. So this kind of combines this effect with a 1/1 body for 1 extra mana. So yeah, pretty much identical to Fairy Circle, just more fairies. With this deck, you'll find yourself creating a heck of a lot of fairies. Loads and loads and loads of fairies. Blessed Fairy Dancer. So this is more of a tech card. You just play a 1 of this in the deck. As we'll see, that this has a very similar effect to Wind God, which we'll see a little bit later, and also Elf Knight Cynthia. They have very similar effects, these 3 cards. But I mean, you just play a 1 of this because it's cheaper. It can allow you to finish off your opponent for less mana. So generally, it's not a very good card to play on curb. You never want to play this on 2. This is just for finishing off opponents. So that you only really play 1 of this because it's not a nice thing to top deck. It's not a nice thing to fill up your hand with. You can't play it on curve, so you only really want to play 1 of this. Rhinoceroach. This is the card that is very similar to the combo in Hearthstone. That this card is extremely strong. So this has Storm, and for each other card played this turn, gain 1/0 until the end of the turn. So essentially, if you play down a couple of fairies, play this, it buffs its attack up. If you play, say, 2 cards before this, and then you play this as a 3/1, then if you play 3 of them, then you'll do 3 damage, 4 damage, 5 damage. So you can kind of chain them together if you have 3 of them in your hand, and you can just do incredible amounts of burst damage. You can also play it, bounce it back with this, and then play it again for even more damage. So say, I don't know, you play 2 cards, you play this, 3 damage, bounce it back, and then now it's worth 4 damage. Actually, I think now it's worth 5 damage because it counts the previous time you played it. So very, very strong card. It's good to get kind of a handle on how much damage this is going to do, because I mean you can kind of calculate, you can kind of chip the enemy down until they're in Rhinoceroach range, and then you can just burst them down to win the game. Generally this is your finisher card. So the aim of this deck, you kind of want to fight for the board, kind of control the board, and snowball wins that way. If that doesn't go to plan, this is kind of your plan B. Then you can still use this card to kind of finish off games if you manage to get their health low enough. So say if they're at like 9, 10, you can generally use a couple of these to just finish them off. Girl Liza. So this card stops all of your ally followers on the board, including herself, from being damaged by spells and effects. So she basically gives them hexproof kind of thing, except they can still cast spells that just won't do any damage. Also spells like Themis's Decree, which just outright destroy minions, it doesn't protect from that, it only protects from damage. So I mean this is good for protecting your board from things like Angelic Barrage or any other kind of board clear that isn't Themis's Decree. It's also very strong just to play this on turn 2. I do that more often than not, just drop this card on turn 2, because I mean it's a 2 mana 2/2, which is pretty decent stats for turn 2. That's what you expect to play on turn 2. Also has the added benefit that they can't use something out of their hand to remove it to get a tempo advantage. I've seen some people try and do that. I've seen some people cast things like Sylvan Justice, or most classes have some kind of 2 mana deal 2 damage card, like Whole Souled Swing for Swordcraft. So I mean if you play this on turn 2 and they use that spell on it, it's essentially free because it won't do anything. So I've seen people do that before. Maybe they don't understand how the effect works, I don't know, maybe they're just trying to get the extra card, but it's also strong to play on turn 2, so it's got a kind of double use, it's a very good card. Sylvan Justice, as I just mentioned, most classes have a deal 2 damage to an enemy follower effect. This one's great because it also puts a fairy in your hand, so very useful. Most Forestcraft decks will play this. Most decks now will tech in 1 Angelic Barrage. It's just to deal with other Forestcraft decks, and also to mostly deal with aggro vampire. So that deck will create a lot of bats on the board, and Angelic Barrage can just wipe that entire board out that they've been building the whole game, and can just win you games. So it's very good to tech in at least one of these. Also, boards can get filled up with fairies if you're in the mirror match, so you can take out their entire board. Very strong. Ancient Elf is one of the strongest cards in the deck. So we're running 3 of this. This is one of the parts that makes it prohibitively expensive, because it runs quite a few legendaries. Ancient Elf is extremely strong. So with Ancient Elf, if you have 2 minions on the board, so say you play a 1-drop, you play something like Water Fairy, or if they go first, they play something and you play Elf Child May and kill it. Turn 2, you play something like Fairy Whisperer or Elf Girl Liza, and then you play Ancient Elf on turn 3, and it bounces those 2 things back into your hand, and it also becomes a 4/5. So a 4/5 for 3 mana with ward is extremely strong. If you can manage to pull that off, it's very, very hard for them to then take the board back, and you'll most likely snowball a victory from that. That's a very strong play. Nevertheless, this still becomes relevant in the late game, because it allows you to play all of your cards out for maximum value. So it allows you to spam Rhinoceroaches, it allows you to get things like Fairy Whisperer out on the board to generate more tokens, Elf Child Mage. You can play all sorts of things on the board, fill your board up and then bounce them back, and really buff up your Ancient Elf in the late game and make it very hard for them. So they need some kind of direct removal like Dance of Death, or they need to spend one of their evolve points to get rid of it, or if they've got no evolve points left, this is a very hard minion to remove. So very, very, very strong minion. Elven Princess Mage. So this is one of the Forestcraft's kind of power 4 cards, where you play it on 4 if you go in second and you evolve it, and it gives you a very powerful effect. So this effect, put 2 fairies into your hand and change their cost to 0. It doesn't look like much, but as you see, there's a combo that you can do with another card that we'll see in a minute, that makes this extremely powerful. So you really want to be playing this on turn 4. Ideally, if you're going second, playing this on turn 4, or turn 5 if you're going first, and evolving it and getting this powerful effect off. Wind God. So we're playing 2 of Wind God, so we've kind of switched out a Wind God for one of these Blessed Fairy Dancers. It has the same effect generally, but Wind God is more powerful. Wind God will give 1/0 to all allied followers. It lasts permanently, whereas Blessed Fairy Dancer only lasts for 1 turn. And it also does the same effect every turn. And she's quite hard to remove, so if you evolve her, she's a 3/7. So she can really snowball your board out of control. Crazy amounts, so she's a very high priority target for them to remove, but she is quite susceptible to mass board wipes and things like Themis's Decree and things like that. That will really wreck her strategy up. So for that reason, that's why we play one of these, and this also gives you a little bit more flexibility, but they suit similar kind of effects. It's for finishing off, for getting lots and lots of damage into the face, also for snowballing victories. So it's a very strong card. Dance of Death, pretty standard. We're running 2 in this deck. This is for dealing with big minions that you can't deal with any other way. So yeah, it's for taking out those key very strong cards that they'll play. And also has the benefit of dealing 2 damage. So with this deck, we want to kind of be chipping away at their health along the way, so this allows you to do that as well. So Crystala Tia, this is the card which in my opinion makes this deck as strong as it is. This is the card that basically the whole deck's built around, pretty much. So what this card does is it will summon a Crystala Eve, which is a 4/4. So you play it as a 1/1 that summons a 4/4, so you get 5/5 stats for 5, which is good. It's very good. It's even better that it's kind of split up, because I mean then you can bounce the original back and play it again. So it's got very good stats, just basic. The thing that makes it OP is the Crystala Eve gets ward and evolves for if at least 2 of the cards are played this turn. So you get a free evolve point, essentially. You get 7/7 of stats, and you don't have to use an evolve point for it, for 5 mana, and it has ward. And you can bounce her back and replay her, so she's just incredible. And she combos with this card. So if you go in second, you play this on turn 4, evolve it and crash it into something to get some kind of tempo advantage. Then you can do this on turn 5. I mean, realistically, you can only do this on turn 7 at the earliest, because I mean you'll need to use some of your 1 mana cards to play 2 cards, or just 2 fairies, and then you'll summon her. So that generally this will be played on turn 7. But with Elven Princess Mage, it allows you to play on turn 5. So on turn 5, you'll either have her left around, maybe not. You'll at least have a 1/1 and a 6/6 with ward on the board on turn 5. That is just incredible. And you can rush her into another one of the opponent's followers for a massive tempo advantage. And you can replay. You can bounce her back into your hand with Ancient Elf. You can bounce her back with Nature's Guidance. All round extremely strong card, and very hard for the opponent to deal with, and this is what makes this deck so strong. And finally we've got Knight Cynthia. We're playing 2 of these. As I said, this is a similar sort of effect to Wind God, so whenever another allied follower attacks, give it 1/0, so it has very similar effect. It also works for Knight Cynthia when you play her. The evolve effect is very strong, which makes Knight Cynthia slightly better than Wind God in general. So when you evolve, you summon 2 fairies for free. So if you evolve Knight Cynthia, your board is now a 6/7 with 2 1/1s. So it's very, very respectable stats. It's also good to play on a full board, because then all of your followers, when they attack, they get an extra damage, basically, kind of like the banner effect, but it stays around, so and it can kind of stack on top of it. If it lasts for multiple turns, their attack can just build up and up and up. So it's good for finishing off games. It combos very nicely with Rhinoceroach. Yeah, so this is the deck, basically. So as I was saying, the object of this deck is to kind of take the board from turn 1, kind of chip away at the opponent's health while also controlling the board at the same time, kind of like how Tempo Mage does in Hearthstone. And then when you get to the late game, well, the mid game rather, you kind of absolutely overwhelm the board with cards like Crystala Tia. You can push for maximum damage with Wind God. You can kind of generate free fairies with Elven Princess Mage, and then you use cards like Elven Knight Cynthia, Blessed Fairy Dancer, and Wind God to kind of push for the lethal damage. If you're still not there, then Rhinoceroach is an extremely strong finisher. You can just burst so much damage with this card in the end game. So you've got simultaneous ways of controlling the board and also bursting down your opponent in the late game. So this deck doesn't really have any glaring weaknesses, but then again it doesn't have any overwhelming matchups, so it's very strong against things like aggro vampire, because they just never get a footing. It is kind of weak to things like D-Shift, but then it's got the burst damage to kind of counter D-Shift, so it's very flexible. If you play it correctly, you can beat any deck with this deck. It doesn't really have any weak spots, and that's why it's generally one of the most played decks in the current meta. So I mean, I'm going to show a game now, just to demonstrate how this deck plays.